mills came in the latter part of the 19th century, and they were very popular because you could drag them around from one woodlot to another. And they were working in southern New Hampshire, then they worked over into Berwick, Maine. And they were basically buying woodlots, cutting them, then moving on to another one. They had a contract with a box company, a pine lumber box company, and there was a woodlot here or a lot of woodlots here in the Whitefield area in the 1920s that my grandfather, Dad's father, heard about. And at that time my father was about 9, I think. He was born in 1912, and I think they came in the I know they came in the 20s, and they came on the narrow gauge, and they first stayed in hovels. A hovel is a temporary housing, it's a slab-built building. They stayed in there. They had, I believe, 9 children. Do you remember, Betty?
What?
How many children in Dad's family? 7 to 9.
7, I think.
Okay, but anyway, they all lived in there, and as the wood business picked up here, they decided to stay. The family was growing, and they bought a house, and they actually lived in 2 different places, and settled here, and went to school here, and that was in the 20s that they arrived. And I remember a town meeting, you may remember it too, where they were talking about the influx of people's effect on the tax rolls, building new schools, things like that, the things that are necessary, new roads. And Pug was giving some sort of a tirade at town meeting about the cost that people coming in inflict upon a town. And I remember Bill Bell, who was really charged for this, got up and he said, well, I heard, Pug, that when the Chasers came to town, they streamed into town, and there was an old man down here at the store in Kings Mills, and he leaned over to his buddy and he says, there, look at that tribe. What do you suppose is going to happen to our school budget now? Chet, Pug, Dodd, Dad, the boys stayed. There was 2 girls. Pearlie stayed, and Bobby married a military guy, so she left, but she's in New Hampshire still. But basically all the boys except for one stayed here in town. Dodd, he worked in the mill, but he also worked at the VA, making prosthetics for people who lost limbs. They all had fairly good-sized families and were very active in the politics and the running of the town. Yeah, my mother was telling me just the other day how vivid she remembered when they got married in 1939 or 40, that they were living with Dad's parents, and Henry Cunningham, who lived where Nerf Sabatine now lives. He was a selectman, but he was also a very unusual character in that in these days when property, this is right at the start, the middle of the Depression, or in depressed times, he would go and buy property to give people some money and then try to find young people to populate the places. And my mother remembers that Henry Warren came to her and she says, where's Norman? Oh, he's working at Bath Iron Works. And he said, well, I think I found just the place for you. And it was this home up, Happy Farm home up in North Whitefield. It was roughly 100 acres of land and an old farm, but it was just right to start a family with. Dad had a cow and chickens and all that stuff while he worked at VIW. I think that basic same thing happened to all the boys. And almost anybody coming into town, they found a piece of land and a building. They needed to work the land, whether they produced wood or lumber or pasture. They were all agrarian, and they all wanted to. I guess everybody did. Everybody had they either had a garden or a cow or chickens or sheep or something. So it was necessary, and Whitefield was right for that. Cunningham woman had a store, but a store meant a room in your house where you had, if you went to town, you'd buy an extra barrel of flour. And I think that in town there might have been 7 or 8 stores which were just, not in the modern sense of a store, but in the sense of storage. A store of things, extra things where you could go and buy. And my grandmother would send the kids down onto the hill, because they lived on the hill across from Cunningham's, to get, vinegar and flour, eggs, butter, and people would swap. If you had some eggs, you'd swap it for this, da-da-da-da, and that's the way it went. And so, yeah, the stores were actually pretty much dependent in those days on the railroad. And those stores were found by the railroad depot because they could get the stuff they needed by train. But it's totally different than it is today. It took quite a while for the cars to be common. It had to be into the middle to late 20s before they were even kind of common. Before then it was always just horse, and the roads were bad condition. And times of year, certainly when snow and mud and so forth, it was impassable. This part of town, Kings Mills, gravitated, south of Kings Mills, gravitated to Wiscasset, and Kings Mills and up to North Whitefield went to Gardner. All of the boys in the Chase family went to Gardner High School. Dodd ran to Gardner High School. And he was at one point considered to be, there was some famous marathon runner who was allegedly trying to interest him in becoming a professional runner, because he literally ran from Whitefield to Gardner, which I guess if you're a marathon runner, that's less than a marathon. But he did it with some regularity. But walking to Gardner, as walking to Damariscotta or Wiscasset, was not out of the question. I remember Warren Erskine saying he lived in South Jefferson, and they would just commonly take the horse down to Damariscotta, ride it bareback.
Mm-hmm.
So communication expectations were totally different.
And electricity, telephone?
I don't know much about that, except that they came in the 20s. I remember reading about how they strung the lines and got subscriptions, very much like the cable guys did. They'll say, if you'll sign up, we'll be able, if we have enough subscribers on this road, we can run a line down here. And that happened in the 20s, gradually. And telephone the same sort of way. But there weren't very many telephones. I have a telephone book from the 20s, late teens, early 20s. And I think the Whitefield listing, if I remember correctly, is somewhere around 12 telephones in town. And they were in the places where you would expect. The general store, the doctor, a selectman, people that had business. And I was going to say, if you needed a phone, people did not perceive they needed a phone the way we do today. We can't imagine living without it, but it was sort of like a super convenience. Alden says that they hired the train one time to go down to Alner and pick up logs that they had cut, and then back the train back to Whitefield, which struck me as just being odd, and because I can only think of a train going frontwards. And he says, well, trains can go backwards at the same speed, and you can't turn that train around. You'd have to go to Wiscasset to the round table, and that doesn't make sense. So they drove the train down to Alna, loaded the logs, and backed it up to Whitefield, to the Clary Mill Pond, and rolled the logs off. Wonderful 3-story belt system from the penstock where the power is produced, and it generated this belt energy for all the whole 3 stories, and it ran jigsaws and planers and routers and all kinds of machinery, and quite efficiently for a long period of time. Turn of the century, I don't know just when it stopped, but probably in the 40s. And but he was always doing other things. He ran a grocery store, he sold farm equipment, he was in the legislature, the Senate, and he sold insurance, and he just did a lot of things, but he also loved to farm. Well, if you're just producing your own milk, cream, and butter, that's okay, you just need a separator and a cool place to keep it. But if you decide that you're going to start a milk route, which he did in the 50s, he started out with just a few customers around the village, but by the time Steve and I got to be teenagers, Dad was in Augusta, doing a lot of work with the legislature and the farm equipment at the same time. We ran the dairy. One night, I would milk the cows and bottle the milk, put it in the cooler, and Steve was on the road delivering. The next night, I was delivering and Steve was doing the milk production. And we did that, it seemed like a long, long time, but it probably was 3 years in our teens that we did that. And before that, Dad had a very small route. He may have produced, I don't know how many customers he had. He may have had a couple of dozen. Where our cellar was always loaded with food, as was everyone's. I mean, I just didn't know anyone
I
who
used to do
didn't.
100 quarts a day.
Yeah, I just didn't remember anybody not doing that, and it didn't seem to be anything like uh, you would notice. Although I did remember after I graduated college and came and was teaching most of the time, I became interested in things like smoking meat and brining and doing things that we actually didn't do. And that was when the new generation that we're going to talk about later came in town. They were super excited about that part of uh, living. You know, not only producing food, but preserving it and making it, what's the word when you upscale food to a higher level? It's worth, added value, I think they say, by adding smoke to it or brining it or packaging it in such a way that becomes attractive to people who aren't doing it. We raised beef, pork,
Chicken,
chickens, and
goats.
goats. We had just all kinds of stuff available. And we would take our meats, particularly the shoulders of the pork, to be smoked, and we'd hang those in the cellar. I mean, that was right, as you know, in the 70s. I was teaching in Wisconsin. I started there in '70, and I lived in Woolwich until we moved here. And it was a great farm. It had everything to start with, a lot of open land and nice buildings, and it was a very exciting time because I arrived at about the same time that what some people would call the back to the landers arrived, and so I was, going home, having been away. I taught 5 years in Rumford and 4 years in Wisconsin before I came up. And so not only did I come home, but I came home to an energetic time when other people, young people, were arriving with great ideas of ways to do things, and it was very exciting and very uplifting. My mother had read it in the paper. I'm teaching in Wisconsin and living in Woolwich, and she calls me up and she says, "Babe, we used to call it the Hardwick. The Hardwick house is for sale, and it's very." She didn't say reasonable. It was reasonable, but only by those days' standards. It was $39,000 for essentially 90 acres of land and a farm on the river. And so I called the realtor right off, who was related to George Garcia, the guy who owned it. And I said, I'd really like to see this place. And she says, well, we're having a open house on Saturday, so I put your name down. Yes, I'll be there. Well, she says, come early. So I came early, and the parking lot was filled. There was just all kinds of people. The first people was a husband and wife team, and they were in the back room with George, and we're in the kitchen. We could hear the conversation, and the guy is a builder, developer from Manchester, and he is so excited. The place looked pretty seedy. The Garcias had ill health, and it wasn't ready for prime time. But you had to look beyond that, which all of us were, except for this guy's wife. And she was crying. And he says, my God, he says, this place has all the potential in the world. We can put buildings across the road. This place will make us wealthy. And she starts crying, and Betty and I are looking at each other saying, we're never gonna get a whack at this, it's hopelessly gone. So she said, finally, the realtor said, well, we have other people waiting, and so the woman says, let's go outside and talk about it, and if the next people don't buy it, we'll buy it. So they walked by us and went outside sobbing, and Betty and I looked at each other and Betty was thinking, this place is a wreck. And I'm thinking, don't go there. So we went in and had a short conversation. I said to George, I said, we'll take it. And I gave him a $50 check. And poor George, I was dealing with the Farmers Home Administration. It was slower than molasses. They'd come up and said, yeah, it was all right. There was probably too much river frontage, but it was okay. Da-da-da-da-da. We'll get you in on the next round of funding. Well, George Garcia sat from February to May with that $50 check. And people are banging on the door every day saying, shaking money, saying, I'll take this right now. As a matter of fact, I'll give you, And I have nothing but good things to say about the honor of that man. He would call me occasionally and say, how things going? And I said, George, cash that check. We'll get it, I'm sure. Well, we finally did, but that's one of our family stories that we really cherish. The new school was built in '59, I believe, and I graduated high school in '60. So all my 8 years were spent in one-room schools.
Which one?
Well, I went to church school, which was up by the Catholic Church. Went to North Whitefield School, which is in the site of just up from the Tim's Dry Kill. And I went to Kai's Corner, which is no longer there, which is over there at the intersection of North and Hunts Meadow and Cooper Road. Just to the right, that's called Kai's Corner, Keyes, and there was a building there. So I went to those three schools.
Why were you moved around? Or
Well, the sessions, Francis Hickey taught at the church school grades 1 through 3, and then the North Whitefield School, Mrs. Snow and John McCormick taught there 4, 5, 6, and then Violet McCormick taught Kai's Corner 7 and 8. But that changed over the years as the population of the town shifted and the ages of the children shifted. They would change. They would, as they do now, kind of. One school would add a grade or subtract a grade. They had a hard time getting teachers. I remember poor John. John McCormick was a wonderful man. He was the postmaster and a scholarly kind of guy. Something happened that the teacher, and it may have been Mrs. Snow, Aubrey Snow's wife, who was teaching, but anyway, she couldn't do it for some reason, and they asked John if he would, because he had a college degree, and well, gee, he'd never done anything like that, and he didn't know, and he was so kind-hearted, but he decided he would. Well, he was completely out of his element, he loved knowledge and stuff, but we were a bunch of ragtag pain in our necks, and he put up with us, and I love books, for instance, and libraries. I've just always been a bibliophile, but in that school we had 4 National Geographic magazines in our library. That's all we had, aside from our reading books, our textbooks, but they didn't have much to work with. Virtually everybody went where the transportation was. Don Pierce, a teacher at Coney, lived in Jefferson, and I rode with Don for 4 years. Don's still alive, great, wonderful man. Rode backwards for 4 years. The seat in his Chevy station wagon faced backwards, and he drove like hell. He would go, easily 75, 80 miles an hour. On these back roads.
On the Cooper Road? Or?
Cooper Road, you got it. And with, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids and himself in this car, long Chevy station wagon, going over these hills. And I remind him of that every now and again. He's such a wonderful guy. He knew he had a heavy foot. So how much I loved winter. We would go out in the first thing in the morning, right after breakfast, literally running with our earmuffs on and a get up, and we wouldn't come in until, well, we came in for lunch, but Doc would bring us in. We would do things like building snow caves, and we would slide and skate and trape through the woods. We'd build buildings in the woods. We would get old used lumber and nail it to trees and make a hut, and we'd go in there and we'd take a 5-gallon metal bucket for a stove, and we would have a stove inside. This is when we were like 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. We had 2 cabins in the woods, and it was not unusual. Lots of kids had that. And the boys would go there, and we would either have some off-color magazines, or we would do some card games. We loved to play cards. We had candles, and it reminded me, after my youth and began thinking about it in other contexts, it reminded me so much of what Huck Finn might have done. Just having a life aside from your family and aside from society, doing absolutely fun things. We hunted a lot. I never shot a deer. The squirrel would be the best thing, but I was always had a .22 and was always blinking something. That was our form of entertainment, and I would have to say that a lot of my friends were in that same mode. We also had we did a lot of brook fishing, trout fishing. Norm Cloutier and I, we both lived right next to Finn Brook. He was twice the fisherman I was, and it was a competitive thing where we would try to get to the brook at the right time. And Norm figured it out, that right after it rained, the trout would come from the river up the brook, and he'd go and he'd get these long strings of fish, and he'd come and drag them in front of my nose and go, ha, 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 and I was always a wannabe non-Cloutier fisherman, but I did fish an awful lot, and I had a lot of fun. We fished the river, we swam a lot. Literally in the summertime, we lived in the river. We just go down there and spend all day. And I remember the bridge there in North Whitefield. We were there one time, and there was a guy in the river, the middle of the river, with a rake, who had taken a window screen downstream about 15 feet, and he'd propped the window screen up against a couple of rocks, and he was upstream raking the rocks. And hellogrammites, which is about the size of your finger, black, nasty little guys with pinchers, were coming down and on the net. And we were fascinated by it. And he would pick them up and put them in a wet bag. And we said, what are you doing with those? And he said, these are hellogrammites. And he said, they are the primo bait for bass or for any great game fish. He said, and this is in 1956, 57, 58, in that area. He says, I pay 25 cents a piece for those. And we said, what are you talking about? I mean, that's like gold, because we figured, well, we could get a couple of thousand in a few minutes, right? Well, anyway, that was a short-lived attempt at entrepreneurial things where we got hellogrammites.
So where was your sliding hill?
Well, right across the road from Happy Farm, there was one there. But you know where, it's really just a knoll, because when you're this tall, it's a big hill. The other one, you know where John Dysart used to live, where Jerry Meldovan lives now, in the big house, across from Mark Fenderson's?
Ah,
That hill that goes up to North Whitefield Village.
okay.
That was a good one. The one that was the best, but so dangerous, and I don't know why we didn't kill ourselves, was essentially parallel to Grand Army Road, from Tim Chase's down to Piper Lane, down to the river. Mike McCormick had a bobsled, an articulated bobsled. The front runners could move like this, and you had a steering wheel, and you sat on it. You didn't put your butt down like you do on a toboggan. You actually sat on a seat, and your feet were on the running things. And it would hold 8, 9 people, and you would sit there like fools and go down over this hill steering, and we would hit things and we'd go flying, but if we'd ever hit a pine tree head on,
You killed
we
one.
would have killed all of us, but we just thought that was great stuff. Later on, in my teenage years, when I was driving the milk route, of course, I got my license real early, and we did interesting things. We had a milk route in Gardner and Randolph, and all of my buddies would always want to go with me on the milk route. And so one of the entertaining things that we did, telling tales out of school here, was to go up back roads like Piper Lane, gun the truck as fast as you could go. It was a 1947 Dodge blue one, and then cut the wheel as hard as you could so that you get spinning, literally like this, up the road. Because you had big banks. It's a one-way, but it's only a one-track road. There's no two tracks. But there isn't much traffic on it. We would do things like that, and it's one of those things that you did with that
And the
oil.
thing leaked carbon monoxide.
Yeah, it was getting pretty gassy in there. We'd have to roll the windows down. Another thing we did, because we had Guernsey cows, the milk had a high fat content. In fact, the cream would rise and it would be almost orange. When those would freeze, and when we were delivering milk in the wintertime, we didn't have our enclosed thing, it would freeze. And the cream would rise the cap right off. It would go 2 or 3 inches above the top of frozen cream. We would carry a jar of Hershey's chocolate, take the cap off, pour it on top there and eat that. And we thought that was just the best thing you could have.
Yeah.
Our youth, I probably went to the movies twice before high school. My grandmother took me out us out to Gardner. We didn't, and bowling, those kinds, we just didn't do those kinds of things until much later in life. Our youth was really doing things on our own, playing marbles. We played marbles on end, but everything was seasonal. You played marbles when the dirt was wet enough so that you could make a hole with your heel. When it was not wet enough, you didn't play marbles. When it was football time, we would go down to where McCormick's place is now, and we would play tackle football in a pasture with rocks like this, because this is what macho, machismo young men did. And we did that in the fall. In the spring, we played baseball, and just was, we always, I think in some degrees, if your parents were good to you, everyone had a good youth. You look fondly on it, and I certainly do. Just wonderful times of doing great things. I was lucky to have old people around the village. Well, I guess I just sort of took to. And my neighbor Joe Dyer, and I wrote a piece about him. I don't know if it's in one of my newsletters. Great old man. He didn't speak hardly any English. He was an old Frenchman. Grew his own tobacco and hung it in the thing. And when we'd go fishing, he'd reach up and grab it and put it in his hand, stuff it in his pipe, and get smoking. And he'd take a alder pole with some string on it and a hook, and we'd get some worms, and we'd go down to the sheepskin and fish. But we would do it in April when there were still, the old-fashioned April, when there was still ice around the alders, and we'd spend hours down there fishing. I don't know what he was fishing for. We never caught anything, but it was a ritual that we did. And if Joe said, let's go fishing, I was gung-ho to go. And his buddy, Pete Sanderson, and Clarence Costin, the two old guys who had girlfriends down on Clary Lake, down to Anna Benson's, and they would go by with the wagon. This was atypical. There weren't very many horses and wagons in the 50s, but these guys had one because they didn't drive. But they would always stop and pick me up, and we'd go up the hill. And I don't remember what they'd either throw me off at the store or take me down to the lake or whatever. But I was always traveling with these old guys, and they were spitting tobacco and telling stories, and I was just sitting there slack-jawed, I guess.